Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the next jump. I think you're in for a pretty packed full 3 days. We'll end with a pretty neat recognition ceremony, which is going to happen on Friday. Hopefully, most of you can stay afterwards for drinks and whatnot. First time we run our academy this way, by the way, where a day is on feedback, a day is on coaching, and then a day is on recognition. So you're going to see what would be a regular week battle rhythm smashed into 3 days and try to absorb as much as you can. So quick tidbit, it's interesting. So Meghan and I, as co-CEOs, one of the things you'll notice is we play very different roles. I think of it as kind of an editor versus a reporter. I don't know which job is more important. You can't edit without a reporter, but a reporter publishes a lot of garbage unless you have an editor helping. So we play different roles here. And so I hopefully will not be garbage, but we had planned to walk you through an opening presentation just around how work is changing. We have access to a tremendous amount of folks in the most cutting edge research, the most on the ground implementation and practices occurring. And we're going to take you through this. Wednesday, we threw all of it out and decided to do something totally different. And it's something that it came up because we run this thing called a situational workshop, which you're going to see, which is a scalable way to coach. We run this for outside parties as well. And one of the situational workshops Meghan and I have been running for a few months now is with some leaders from the Navy. And one of the questions that came up was a challenge they face with what we would typically call a C player or someone in a C state. Think of A's being when you're on fire, and I'll explain more what a C is. And the general notion that we found that people make mistakes on is that you believe your A performer can't get much better or do much more, right? They're already contributing so much to the organization. The belief that you can get more out of them is almost like asking them to sleep less and work more hours. So we tend to back off trying to squeeze more productivity out of that. But we look at our C's, right? And especially when they're in important roles. And you feel this massive imbalance in their contribution relative to their take from the organization. In fact, it might be zero or even negative. So we don't think of it this way, but we're saying there's more potential there. This is where I can squeeze more productivity out. And so we put so much time, energy, attention to that. And in fact, the most common mistake we tend to make, if you look at your calendars in a week, if you're in a leadership role, you're a principal of a school, doesn't matter. As long as you have people who report into you, your mornings tend to get filled with these individuals. They want your time. They've got a list of issues, and you spend all your greatest energy on them. And then by afternoon, you go to your A's. Can I figure out how to help you? And they say, don't worry, sir, or ma'am, or boss, or whatever they say. And they say, I got it, right? I know you're busy, and you can see your eyes are like glazed over, and they're like, I'll be fine. And so we have spent years trying to share that sequence matters. Although everyone matters, how you prioritize who you help first can make a difference. And yes, you can definitely get C's to improve, but it's a very, very hard thing, something that even we struggle with. And you can actually get A performers to increase their performance 5 to 10x. So not 5 to 10%, but 5 to 10x. And this is something we've helped do repeatedly, not only in our organization, but externally as well. But despite saying this, the sequence should be focus on the A's first, getting 5 to 10x, and then you focus on helping the C's get better. It just sucks up our energy, our time. And so Meghan and I had a huge argument about this on Wednesday after our situational workshop. I think it was John Wainwright and Rudy who brought up a challenge and explained, and Meghan's point to me was, we do this too, right? We know, even though we teach it what's the right sequence and order, we feel guilt, we worry about them, we want more, and it just sucks up our bandwidth. So we need to cover this topic. So this idea of how do you get people who are stuck, unstuck? The notion of even what a C state or a C, and we started using the word C state versus C player. I think if you're in a C state for too long, you become a C player in everyone's eyes. But even then you can get unstuck. And so how would you do that?
So we have 2 hours for this session. So we normally do not run it like this. We would normally walk you through an overview of how the world's changed, why work is changing, but we are running this completely differently. So for those of you who've been to an academy, it's gonna be a little different. We're gonna do a lot of teaching. We want reactions and thoughts and questions. Maybe give us a chance. I would say at least maybe like a half an hour to just kind of like get all of our thinking out. As much of we've organized it enough from the editing side. I think we've organized it enough that it's going to make sense, but recognizing this is new-ish content, we've never taught this before. It's taking a lot of information and trying to pull it together. So bear with us. I think give us a little time to do that, but then we kind of want to open it up and get reactions, get comments, get questions, because we do believe this is a very big challenge plaguing every organization, and every individual has gone through this. You have been in a depressed, depleted, outcome biased, must get this done, motivational issues, feeling complacent. There's not a person who's not ever felt this way in their life, and we'll go through it consistently through life. So we think this is huge, even as a parent, for children, for spouses. We think it's a really big topic. So we'll take you through this. We'll do some Q&A. We'll do bio breaks, by the way. If you need a bio break, go. Like there's a lot of military here. You don't need an escort. You don't need anything. You don't need to ask. You can just go. Seriously, just go. And you can stand up if you need to. It can get uncomfortable sitting versus standing. It's a 2-hour session. So move around if you need to. Do whatever you need to do. And that's okay. Do whatever you do. There's snacks. There's food everywhere. And then there's a lot of snacks on the tables, Feel free, do what you need to do to stay engaged. And then we have a really interesting session right after this that we're also going to be judging in 10X. So we're excited about this. Anyways, we'll kick off, and then we'll ask for questions. I'll kind of give you guys a cue, and then we'll go from there. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to start off by sharing with you, I don't know how many people have heard of a company named Fisker. Most of you have heard of Tesla. In the first decade of the 21st century, the information age, these two companies got created, and sort of very appropriate given it's the information age, the technology age. You have two companies created to change how automobiles work, to move from gasoline to electricity. And what's interesting about Tesla and Fisker is we had the chance to meet a guy who led a very fascinating analysis, studying the data of the number of Google employees who left to join Tesla versus Fisker. And what was interesting in what he studied was this: in the window when they ran the study, all the reporters and all the analysts talked about how Fisker was going to be successful and Tesla would not make it. What Fisker did was built the car that would run on electricity, and when it runs out, it goes to gas. So it was that hybrid solution, right? I mean, this fear of like being stuck in the middle of the highway when you don't have power. Fisker built that car, and Tesla said, we're going to go straight to electricity. And in that same window, his name is Jack Hiddery, he ran this analysis with his team, and they found out that Google employees were joining Tesla at a ratio of 20-1 to Fisker. For every one employee who joined Fisker, 20 went and joined Tesla. And his point was this: looking just at talent, you could predict who was going to win and who was going to fail. Fisker went bankrupt several years later, and Tesla now is worth more than most automobile companies in the world. And yes, they've had their fair challenges and all these other things, but literally, if you go back in time and look at the news and what every smart person was saying, everyone logically was saying this will succeed and this will fail. And yet the single biggest indicator of future success is now where talent is going. Talent is staying, and of course, where talent is growing. So people kind of become this big difference maker. And a simple way to think about what's changed in this century is people end up driving products, and a lot of us have projects. And that leads to your numbers or your results. And when you think of numbers and results, whichever business you're in, whichever industry you're in as outcome, the process of getting outcome, they always say we're too outcome obsessed. We need to obsess more in process. So what is the driver? What is the lever? And I think in the 21st century, the single biggest change that's occurred And there's a bunch of videos up on our YouTube channel if you get a chance to take a look. So this is the talk we were going to give, which is the difference between an organization built like an elephant versus an organization built like a cheetah. In the industrial age, organizations were built like an elephant to go slow and steady. Slow and steady won the race, and that's how things worked. Versus now you need to move fast and agile. If you have someone who's making a plan, a 1-year plan, a 5-year plan, I mean, the amount of time you spend on the plan will be obsolete usually by the time you print it, because the assumptions are changing that fast. And what's interesting, if you think about the #1 asset in the industrial age were machines, technology. And so that was the greatest lever of success, but it's also where most of your problems came. So as a result of it, the entire industry just got obsessed on how to run machines to get success, but to prevent the accidents. Well, in the information age, despite it sounding like it should be around technology, even looking at a company like Tesla, the driver of success is still people. You look at tech companies, the #1 thing they all talk about they can't get anymore, it's not capital. It's not even building product, it's getting engineers. It's tied to people. And so the very same thing tends to occur, which is the greatest asset, the greatest leverage point for every organization is people, but it's also where all the problems come. The greatest challenges, the greatest problems are actually driven by people, but it's also the opportunity. So these things tend to have a yin and yang aspect to it. So when you look at talent, there's just generally speaking 3 ways to think of talent. How do I attract talent? How do I retain talent? And then how do I develop it? And the key, I know some of you in the culture tour were asking about hiring. I'm sure you'll go into details of what perks do you do and what strategies do you have to retain. Well, you'll see it always comes down to this. Organizations, teams, and cultures, no matter the industry, whether it's sports, whether it's medicine, whether it's the military, whether it's whoever develops people better tends to retain them better and tends to attract them better in the long run. In the short run, I mean, it gets a crapshoot. You hire a great executive recruiter, you might attract someone once, but then they'll probably leave. Someone wants to leave, you pay them a ton or give them some, perk or bonus that locks them in. Maybe you retain them, but in the long run, there's only one main lever. And the real reason is this. People, end of the day, short-term, long-term, it all comes down to pay. Short-term is what you get paid in terms of salary, benefits, equity, bonuses, but long-term pay is education. If you grow my abilities, and this shows up in the Gallup polls and everything else, what people are asking for, mentorship, career development, they want to get educated because if you increase my long-term potential, I get paid more in the future. I want to maximize my pay in the short term. And this quick short-term pay quickly plateaus, so then all the focus goes to education. And when you think of development, the research shows up pretty much saying all the same things. There's 3 ways to think of development. There's a beginner stage, there is a hazard stage, and there's an expert stage. The beginner stage is when we all start off saying, I know nothing. So this is the I know nothing phase, right? First time you join an organization, first time you take a class, you're like so anxious to learn because I know nothing. The hazard stage begins somewhere where you start to believe I'm an expert. I got to tell the company how to run the company better. I got to tell the leadership, the managers how to manage better, right? How do I know? Because I've been here. I know. Some people say 2 weeks is enough. Some say 2 months is enough. Some say it's 2 years. But there's some window where you start to go into this phase where you believe you know much more than you actually do. And then, of course, when you get to the expert stage is when you start to realize, I know nothing again. You start to realize how little you know. Now, there's a song about this topic, right? I think something about how much they thought, they knew nothing, and then they thought they knew everything at somewhere in their 20s, and then later they realized how little they know. Different Dunning-Kruger effects to different researchers all kind of point to something very similar, which is development goes through these phases. And in the process, I think when we think of development, what's interesting about even this academy is this. So I'm going to share with you kind of the quick evolution. we started going back around 12, 13 years now, 12 years, just doing culture tours, the tour you went on. And people were taking the tours and started asking a lot of questions. Can you teach me what you did on the wall? And the reason we did the tours is because Meghan and I were tired of repeating the same thing over and over again. So we literally started putting it up on the walls and training everyone to do it. And we run a lot of tours between our offices, 3,000, 4,000 a year, different organizations requesting constantly. And then in the process, we ended up building our leadership academy, the very first one, February 2014. And instead of trying to do it while standing in the hallway, we started to run a half-day session that turned out, before you know it, into a 3-day session that now runs every other month. And our intention, and I don't think this will change, is to give away this knowledge for free. It is part of our pro bono efforts. I think our belief is that we should be giving knowledge away for free. And so it is something that has been very interesting for us. The more we've given away, the more we've gotten back. You know, that phrase that comes from the Bible, right? The more you give, the more you get. It's a true statement. The part they leave out in the Bible is how long it might take before you get anything back. Some literally organizations and teams have spent 10 years before they come back. And, you know, but it is something we just kept doing. And we had this tremendous seat of just knowledge pouring in. Researchers and practitioners and organizations globally, I mean, thousands of leaders sharing what they're struggling with above all else. And then they've taken things they learned here and they tried stuff. And the one ask we had in all our academies was this: try something. Within the first week when you go back, try something, anything. If it doesn't work, reach out to us. Try something. But if you don't try something, please don't ever, ever reach out to us again. And that is something that we have put out, and it's resulted in a fascinating view of what gets adopted and what doesn't, what works and what doesn't, and what are the challenges in the adoption process. So we've done this academy for now over 6 years. And then in the course of the academy, what evolved was, you know, we have technology we built just to run our own company. It's kind of like the most successful product of Microsoft is Microsoft Excel. That product was built actually to run internal expenses. It was like an expense tracking system. Became their most successful product. We had a lot of technology we built to run our own company, mostly engineers, and we have no HR department, so everyone's HR. And engineers hate doing repetitive work, and they kind of don't like doing HR. But we made it half of their pay. Half of their compensation is tied to how well they run this culture, how well they run HR. They ended up building over 50 applications to run our company better. And so through our academies, our intention was to once again give away all the knowledge. We started giving all the technology away. And then going back several years, 100 of the largest firms came back saying, can you rebuild this for me on an enterprise version? A version that I can use, I don't want the free version, I want the enterprise version. So we did this very odd thing, which is we decided to figure out, in our world, it's called beta testing. We wanted to get a paid beta client to help us figure out how to get the technology more enterprise ready. And you can't do it in the boardroom, you have to do it in practice. So we interviewed 100 of these, I mean, these are huge firms, from CIA to JP Morgan Chase, I mean, Air Force, Navy. We went through, and Meghan and I met with the heads of these firms to find out who was most serious about doing this, who had the greatest need, who had the greatest real intent. And we interviewed and spent like 6 months saying no to 99 of them to pick one. And the one we picked was the Navy. And we've been working with the Navy for around a year. And I want to share with you some of what we learned, because I think there's some very key parts that came out of this. So one of the things that the Navy did was they took around 100,000 people, so 100,000 sailors in the Navy, and they created this volunteer opportunity to be transparent. And when I say transparent, you will experience this thing with the feedback app. The feedback app has both two very unique qualities. One, it's anonymous as a giver. No one can tell who gave the feedback, but it's transparent, as in your entire community that you're in can see the receiver's feedback. So if I did badly and I get a 1 with critical feedback, I know it's from my community, and everyone in my community can see what was said about me. So, and these are very unique elements that were refined over the years. And so the Navy asked 100,000 sailors, volunteer to be transparent. Said another way, I want you to expose your problems. So expose the problems versus the opposite would be to hide the problems. And I don't know if this number is high. I feel it's high. Roughly 10% actually hand raised and chose to do it. Some of them are in here. 10% chose to jump in, right? And remember, like, this is an organization that has an annual review, and depending on what happens in that thing, it determines your pay and career and whatnot. So, I mean, everyone's hypersensitive, like most organizations, but I think the military is even more from what we saw on what happens in your ranking, how you're performing, and especially if it's documented and then viewable by everyone. 10% hand raised. There was a lot of difficulty in the process, but 10% hand raised and actually chose to expose the problems versus hiding the problems. And you have to recognize an organization that is built to hide problems, which, by the way, is how every organization got built in the industrial age. This was an age where information on a need-to-know basis, which kind of comes up in movies and whatnot, this is the truth. Most people don't make decisions, and most people don't need to know what's going on. And so the organization is built to get people to, in essence, not speak up. And there's a lot of courses and ethics and sexual assault and, everything to speak up. But the reality is most people don't, because it's set up this way. And when you think of the challenges that people have, which we tend to naturally want to hide the problems. There's a woman named Susan Cain. I think she spoke at last year's Avengers event. The Power of Quiet. She's the introvert expert in TED Talks. So her new book that she's writing is something around joy and sorrow. How to be truly human, you need to show both, right? Your joy and sorrow. But if you think about the imbalance in social media and the internet, right? We magnified our joy and then we shut down our sorrow massively, right? Whether it's pictures of your children, right? Who puts the picture of your tantrum child up on the social media, right? Like looking at your worst. And I know there's been a bit of a trend of showing no makeup pictures and whatnot, but that's a tiny fraction relative to what we tend to do, right? I don't know if you ever posted the worst pic of your vacation when you go on vacation. Like, no, it's more like take the best picture out of 100 and then filter it like crazy. So what it ended up doing is it makes everyone else feel like everyone's life is better than mine. And so there's a massive imbalance on this joy and sorrow notion. So people are naturally in that instance going to hide their problems. But so what's interesting is not the 10% that volunteered, but when we dug a level deeper, it got a little bit more interesting of who didn't want transparency and then who really wanted it. And this is where it got even more interesting. So kind of second level in. So the people who were most against transparency were what I would call in the middle. So within the officers, so I'm going to use some military language, they call them O3s, O4s, O5s. Within the enlisted, so there's two different groups, at least there's many groups in the military, including contractors and civilians, but all things we had to learn the hard way. They're not just sailors. E4, E5, E6. They didn't want their mistakes exposed. And think about it. Leadership, management is a sport. You build muscle. And what happens when you play the sport for the first time? You tend to do it wrong. And who are you doing it? Who are you inflicting this wrong on? You're inflicting this wrong on people that report into you, and they now have the ability to anonymously speak up and make transparent what you've done. We heard all kinds of pushback on good order and discipline. I can't get them to march to war, right, unless they listen to me. And so they didn't want this exposure, that kind of that blemish on my leadership, and how can I lead when they're calling out my mistakes? So I need to suppress those problems. Yet on the flip side, here's what we found the people who wanted the most. So the first one was the CO, the commanding officer. The commanding officer had a disproportionate responsibility signing up for everything that's happening in that command. And it was their solo signature going on. They have triads of leaders, but still it was their signature, and they wanted the truth. They wanted the truth, and I think it was Guillermo who said, I don't worry about the bad or the critical feedback I'm getting. I'm worried about the feedback I'm not getting. The things people aren't saying to me that's happening underground that I'm not seeing. But then here was the other thing we found. Within the enlisted, the most junior enlisted, E1s, E2s, maybe even up to E3s, they wanted this the most. In fact, we sat through Q&A sessions, some really tough ones, where they didn't sound like they wanted it, because when you could see their face, they would raise their hand and follow the lead of their bosses and fight violently, coming up with every hypothetical way that this little app could lead to all kinds of terrible things, national security breaches, and like everything you can imagine you could creatively come up with. They come up with a list, and they just start attacking us. But then in the very same session, after the session was over, they would come to us behind the scenes and beg us to keep the app. And I was like, wait a second, you were the one, and they were like, we don't have a voice. We can't say something without having repercussions, without retribution. They have surveys that come up, and they will talk about how, I think it's a climate or DEOC survey is what they call it. They would literally shoot straight down the middle, because any variation of what they say can usually be identified. If you're a female and you happen to be this and that, they can just figure it out. So kind of staying neutral, to not speak up and not really voice your opinion, was what they said. And this, by the way, is the largest group. It's what I would call the crowd or the mob in any command in the military. And we have that probably in every organization. So this was very interesting. And which leads to this topic about the C state. And you think about jobs versus, I'm just going to call them the players, if you think of sports. And there are four main variations that kind of matter in this discussion. So someone who has an A job, right? An A job is critical. And basically, if you're here, you're matched well, right? You have a very important job with a lot of responsibility done by someone who is performing at an A level. And then you have a match here. There are always jobs in organizations that are just less risk. In fact, in today's organization, I would say it's jobs with less thinking or independent decision-making abilities. It's more straightforward. It's a lot clearer what to do. And you have individuals who are in this state. And then when you have someone who has a C job but is performing at A levels, so this is usually where we promote, right? But the problem for us all comes right here. This is where there is more emotional toil as a leader when you have someone who has an important job, but they're in a C mindset. And how do you work with that? Now, I'm going to define a little further what I mean by, I totally run out of whiteboard space. I've never done this one. So I'm going to call this a C state. And there are 5 traits that we came up with just since Wednesday. So I'm sure we can make it longer after this week. But one is outcome bias. If you haven't heard of outcome bias, you're so biased to the outcome, you almost don't care about process. The most extreme examples in sports is, if I can break the opponent's kneecaps, we can win the game, right? Like, it doesn't matter how you do it, I need to get the outcome. So outcome bias tends to drive a tremendous amount of short-term benefits, terrible long-term consequences. The second is desperation. If you do anything when you feel desperation, I think whether it's hiring, promotions, it just leads to very bad things. Depleted, when you feel depleted. And I think when we think depleted, we think physical depletion, but emotional depletion is far worse. When you feel like your mind is just gone. Emotional tilt. So tilt is a word that we get from the game of poker. But emotional tilt is we can flip-flop between being angry and sad. One way to look at it is that you can get hostile, right? You might feel everyone's out to get you and attack you. Or the flip side is you might feel fragile, right? Fragile and unsafe. And the last one is just lost and stuck. And what's interesting about the C state is that when someone is in that window, these 5 tend to show up. But I hate to tell you, we will all be in that window at some point or another. We have all been in that window. And so the key isn't to sort of determine like the character of like you're either those 5 things or not. It's recognizing it happens to all of us. And I think of sports as almost like playing defense and offense. We all need to learn how to play defense. And the more skilled we get, the more muscle we'll build. We can actually traverse through this process faster. And that's the key. It's not to be able to avoid it, because the more have you ever avoided these things, right? Which is, there are usually imbalances in people. There are people who are, just dive into the problems, even to the point of recklessness, and those who deny it and avoid it. But there's different types. We call them arrogant versus insecure. So some people hate that language, especially the arrogant ones, right? So whoever feels insecure, raise your hand, right? Whoever's not, you know who you are, right? We're arrogant. We're overly confident. We don't have as much humility. Versus you can be overly humble, not enough confidence. And that's what leads to arrogant deciders, decision makers tend to make arrogant calls at the point of stress. Insecure do the opposite. They make insecure calls. But the reason why this list is important is this. One of the interesting things we found was that decision making, which is the unique aspect of human beings, making the right judgment call. And the challenge, by the way, I'll walk you through, is not once, but you're gonna have to do it repeatedly, usually 7 right calls in a row to get a touchdown or to a certain level of success you can bank. Decisions follow our emotions. Now, I know some of you here, you're very good, I'm sure you are, at doing data-driven decision-making. I put my emotions aside, right? And, I'm just that talented at just shoving that part of myself out, just compartmentalize, and I make a dispassionate, unbiased decision. And you might even think that this side of you never comes out, right? If you haven't driven around, if you haven't tried anything difficult, yeah, this might never show up. But if you pick up anything challenging, these things will show up. When you pick up something challenging where other people can see it, meaning the notion of exposing versus hiding, they'll show up even more, because human beings, we tend to be, we always grade on a scale. We're always comparing. They tell you stay in your own lane. Like, that's what we're supposed to do. You can't stay in your own lane. We can run so many tests and we run interviews. And literally when you have teams competing, you just have to throw out a laughter. It doesn't matter who it's from. Everyone's going to think one team is having fun and we're not. It's amazing how difficult it is to stay in your own lane. It's just almost impossible. And so you can train yourself to actually go through these states and get out faster. But decisions follow our emotions. You'll see this happening when, we say like the most important decisions you make when you joined the military, say, to risk your life, that might not have been the most logical choice at times, right? The advice you got from friends and family and people might not have been to go do that. When you usually decide to get married to someone, sometimes it's not the most logical choice. And if you've had friends or parents come up with a logical list of the reasons why this will not work out, and you look at it, you agree with it, throw it out, you go make what you say with your gut or your heart. That's an emotional choice. We do this all the time. And you'll find the most important things, we tend to make emotional decisions. And so the notion of not fighting it, but understanding how to process our emotions is the key, which is why you'll see an app we built that you'll try out called OMM, On My Mind, is really tied to helping you become more aware of your own emotions. The feedback and getting feedback from a colleague, which is the hardest thing to do. Hearing what your colleagues think, what your community thinks of you, not your boss. The boss is supposed to be tough on you, is supposed to be critical on you, but what the people I'm with think, that is hard. And Greg and Tom are going to cover more of this as we go through, but I'm trying to think. So this is part of the setup of understanding where the biggest issue comes. And if you think about this, one of the interesting things about outcome bias, as the coach, as the leader, the person in charge, when you have someone in an A position performing at C levels, right? What we tend to do is we have outcome bias as a coach, right? That job needs to get done. So are we going to focus on getting them better and set the right way, or are we going to focus on outcome? We focus on outcome. But here's what we found that was even more perverse. That individual is 2 times more outcome biased than the coach. You think they want to fail? You think they don't know? They are twice as high in their outcome bias. They're looking to latch onto anything that might give them score, that might give them results. And so usually this is the worst state to be in terms of getting advice, right? And you'll find this, they take advice from strangers on the subway or on the bus. I mean, it's like crazy where like they'll make these crazy decisions and latch on to advice that comes from anywhere. They're dying to succeed even more than the coach. And so going into this, what we found was this. So like kind of, if you understand and appreciate what the situation is, the number one thing to first think about is not how to help them get better, but it's actually to stop doing more wrong. We as a coach, as a leader, we go in with the intention to help them. And we end up doing, there's 2 things we do that end up doing more damage. So this is the dial down the wrong. We do more wrong, although we intend to help. And in the process of doing more wrong, this thing spirals to get worse and worse, right? So when you, and you're going to say something?
I'm not going to show the whole
Oh,
thing.
you know, sorry, I'm like probably running out of whiteboard space, but
We can
you know, I'll show you this interesting thing. There's a lot of interesting data we get just from across different industries. And one of the more interesting ones was understanding kind of this notion of once someone becomes a C player, what happens? And we have a board member who built a fascinating hedge fund. And he built it by collecting over 20 years of data on every stock analyst in the world. So every recommendation they've made for 20 years and how those recommendations performed, right? It's kind of an interesting set of data. And you track this performance. And what he found was this. You apply an 80-20 rule, 80% of the analysts, literally you will lose money following their recommendations. It's better to just go with the average S&P. Just average index fund is going to do far better than 80% of the analyst recommendations. But you apply the 80-20 rule twice. And what he found was roughly 16%, you're going to pretty much break even. So you won't lose money, but that's not very good. You're investing to make money. It was only the top 4% who's really going to help you make money. It's kind of depressing, right? But and what he found was this. They were right 62% of the time. So being right is that difficult, which is why even coaching someone out of a C state is so difficult. We're going to first talk about how to prevent doing more wrong. But 62%. So then they looked at the bottom 4%. And this was even more interesting. They were wrong 74% of the time. In fact, they made more money going with the exact opposite of their recommendation. And you think about the idea that, you know, information and decision making. I mean, this is as bright as they come, right? You're talking about the smartest people who go to the best schools, looking at more information than you can imagine across everything, globally, company-wise, people, everything, to then make a decision on where to spend your money, to buy or sell something. And so 74% wrong, 62% right. And this is where the reason why this is important is when someone is in this job that's important and is performing in a C state, this is the damage that shows up. And when the damage shows up, we go into this circular thing. I'm sure we've all experienced at some point. I don't know if you ever want to shake them, right? You're angry, obviously. How the hell could you do this? Like, I mean, literally, you look at it and you're like, oh my God, how could you do this? So then you go into this state where you're like, that's a waste of my energy, so I will ignore them, right? So then you end up ignoring them. But this uniquely human thing creeps in, which is guilt, right? And I start to feel guilty because, you know, I should be coaching them. I'm a better leader. I should be able to help them. So you go and coddle them, and that shows up in different ways, which I'll show you in a sec. And then what happens? They go and drive again, and then you want to shake them. And you just repeat this loop, right? And maybe some of you haven't fully experienced this, but this is crazy how fast this cycle can go. And so
And just to be clear, we're talking about the AC. This is important because the job is that important. They're responsible to drive results. They're in a position of power and they're not getting the job done. That's the frustrating part as a, as a human, right? As a coach, you need to get the results. And what I find I want to say sometimes is hurry up and process your stuff because you got to get this done, which sounds awful, right? But that's actually what's happening. Hurry up because you need to get results done because you're in that position. Not the case for somebody who doesn't have such a high responsibility, but it's those few people where you feel so frustrated. It's the frustration, but then quickly goes into, I feel bad, right? So I go from really angry to really just frustrated. I'll just ignore them and let them figure it out to then coddling. That's the vicious cycle. We're saying from our own experience. I think if you have a position or have people under you who have that, that's what I think is happening all the time. It's this vicious cycle. I'm angry, I'm sad, I feel guilty. Repeat. I'm angry, I'm sad, I feel guilty. Repeat. And this vicious loop.
So one of the first things we do wrong is we are trying to continuously get them to drive. We need to, and remember, it's not an on and off switch, which is the difference in machines and people. You need to dial down the amount they're driving, especially where there's A jobs and A things, and we need to dial up their self-awareness. So I'll explain to you a different way. There are 3 levels of awareness. So it starts with self. Then it goes to team. You have to understand, right? The other players on the situational awareness. You have to understand what's happening. And then when you do all that, you're driving. You drive. Decision making. If I had to draw a diagram, think of this as like being in a car, right? And you have team and whatnot. And then think of this as looking at the roads, the trees, right? Like all the obstacles and driving, right? I mean, very simple analogy. If the person is drunk, you don't want them driving, right? And when they're drunk, the thing you have to do is sober them up. And there's a certain degree, and I think we'll talk more in detail about what we mean by sobering up. But you think of what is happening here in 2 parts. There's part 1 and part 2. We are so outcome obsessed on part 2, the need to get the job done. We're not taking the time to do part 1 right. And when I think of what we tend to do, and this is kind of a very subtle way that we make a mistake, we show them a piece of the map. Imagine taking someone who's drunk and telling you that I'm fine, I'm going to be fine, right? And you know they're drunk, but you're telling them there's a really important meeting that's happening an hour away in Long Island, and it starts in like 30 minutes. Them hearing that, they will jump in and they will floor the gas and drive. We end up actually bringing them into the situation more times than not, where it's fascinating what tends to happen when someone is in this state. There are 2 things we tend to do. It's what I call the hidden demotion. So the hidden demotion looks like this. One is we calm them out, so they're out of the loop on communications, right? Because once again, if they aren't situationally aware, they tend not to drive. They might be sitting in their car, but they're going to drive the minute you calm them in, so we tend to calm them out. They're out of certain email groups, out of certain meetings. And you tend to leave them in the dark so that they don't accidentally start driving. And the minute you coddle and calm them in, you'll see them drive again, right? The other thing we tend to do is we tend to dial down their responsibilities. Now, it's interesting how this occurs. There's many ways this occurs. Oftentimes, we end up bifurcating the positions. In most companies, years ago, there was only one person in charge of technology. But if that person's strong, companies will still have one head of technology. But now there's a CTO, a CIO, maybe a head of engineering, head of cybersecurity. There used to be one head of HR. Now there's a head of HR. There's a head of talent, as in the HR head doesn't do talent. There's a head of learning, which once again, the HR head doesn't do learning. Like, it's amazing how you start to find passive aggressive ways to manage these situations. You start to dial down responsibility from one individual You start to create separate units. And so this is something we do. And what's interesting is, although this sounds awful, I would argue this is still the right thing to do. But the problem is this: we are doing this, and then because of guilt, we stop doing it, and then the whole cycle keeps going. And what ends up happening is, because we know part 2 is so important, we need something else to latch onto. And this is the part of actually needing to help them get sober. And so we'll spend a little bit more time, but the second thing in this process, so I don't know if this makes sense. We're going to ask questions and all this, but the second one is separating intrusive versus compassionate leadership. We got this spending time with the Navy SEALs and liked it a lot, which is intrusive but compassionate leadership. Right? You need to be intrusive, especially when you're running something that has an A-job aspect. You can't afford to run it like an intramural sport, right? Thanks for trying. You did your best. It's not good enough. Like, there's a real cost for the enterprise failing. So as a result of it, you have to be intrusive, but you have to find a way to show compassion. But the biggest mistake that occurs is the truth is oftentimes intrusive. The idea of feedback. And then compassion is where the coaching comes in essence, helping you process what's happening. The problem is it's the same person doing both. You're the only one giving the truth, right? You're the only one giving the truth, and then it's like the very next minute you're trying to coach them on that. I'm sure we've all done this, right? I want to tell you how much wrong you're doing, and all this stuff. Now I'm going to help you process what I just told you, right? I'm going to try to help you work through it, and the person isn't listening. They just feel like they're terrorized, they're under attack. And so you're coming in with this intention to be helpful, but you end up leaving feeling like an asshole. And I know most of us have been in this position. And so what we have found was you need to find a way to get the feedback to come from others so that you can then help them process it. And when you have the same person giving the truth and the only one giving the truth, which tends to happen, especially when it tends to be people in these roles, you find the whole thing just falls apart. So the only lever we tend to use is volume, right? So like we just go louder, we're more threatening. And then we're trying to coach them to help them. And we're wondering why it's not working. So you need to find a way to separate this. So I don't know if any questions so far in any of this.
We could open up questions, but we could also take a quick bio break. Do you want to do a question?
Question?
Yeah, go ahead.
We just had Chris and I had a speech that was given by Dr. Liz Cavallero from the Naval War College. And I think that bottom point is fascinating because one of her premises for peer coaching, because that's kind of her focus point, is that if you reflect, like self-reflect on your life, in order to achieve, promote, and foster personal growth for yourself and others, you need that combination, that balance of challenge and support. And so I just find this fascinating because you're right, that feedback from others, sometimes, that provides the challenge kind of from a safe standpoint. And then you've got those trained coaches, who are there to offer the support to promote that growth.
No, that's exactly it. And then I think we were going to share kind of where feedback can go wrong, where it doesn't feel safe, and where people will then fight it even more, which has a lot to do with.
But can I tell you the challenge that model would have? How many trained coaches can you hire for how many people? And I think that, at the very, very top, and this is the challenge most organizations have faced. How do you do this in scale? How do you do it so it's not just for less than 2% of my people?
But the premise is right, that feedback is not coming directly from or only from the coach, we should say. It's not that the coach can't give any feedback, it's that they're not hearing it when that same coach is then trying to help them process it. Because you're either going to feel angry that the coach is giving you the feedback, It's your job to tell me this. You're either my boss or you're somebody senior, so you're supposed to tell me I suck, or you get really sad, right? You feel you've disappointed that leader, disappointed that coach. So I find they either feel really angry and hostile about it, or they feel really sad to the point of I'm disappointing you and I can never do anything right and I feel awful about it. But you're right in that's the model we're trying to create. It's just not the trained. Why you're reacting is the notion of a trained coach. We're trying to train everybody to learn how to do this.
Right. So what we're trying to do, by the way, in this opening talk is kind of walk you through what's happening, in fact, how it goes wrong for one individual. What Tom and Greg will cover is the notion of how to do it in scale. Which is really tied to how to set up and train your community to come to the aid. We believe in outside coaches. We get some of the best in the world interfacing with us. It's just that it's never going to be able to cover the community, the whole organization. And so you have to, this is what people call culture. It's what people call like everyone needs to be both a student and a teacher to kind of set up that community. So, and if you think of what Harvard did in their study for DDOs, they basically studied saying this notion of development, can it happen in scale, out of the classroom, not just on a jumpstart basis of Leadership Academy for 3 days or a lecture, but happening on an everyday basis, weekly rhythm. And that's what they call DDOs. A company who's figured out how to do it in scale. And that's what, hopefully over the course of the 3 days, we will share everything we've learned. And I don't want you to take away that we figure this out. We are far from done. In fact, we have challenges in the same realm over and over again. And so this is a very challenging topic. I think in hindsight, machines are a hell of a lot easier than people. We always say if you could open someone's heads, everyone's heads, and see what's really going on, God, it's so much easier to go figure out what's going on. Like kind of like a Jean Grey, X-Men type, read their minds, like Professor Xavier. I mean, think about trying to operate in a machine, make a machine better when something's not working without opening up the hood, only doing it from the outside, which, by the way, is exactly hiding the problems is. When it comes to people, when you don't open it up and don't get to see what's happening, it's like trying to fix the machine without opening up the hood. Question?
I was with you. I'm actually still struggling with dial down driving. Part one and part two. Can you just slow down this a little bit?
Sure.
Back over that, because I feel like that's fundamental. If I don't get it, it's hard to keep up.
I think the simplest analogy I use is the driver and the driving notion, right? Remember, there are people in the car, right? And especially if you have an important role. When you make decisions, this data point will come true, which is close to the majority, the supermajority, 74% of what they decide, every call they make, will be the wrong call, which means it hurts the enterprise, it hurts the team. And so getting someone who is drunk to go and, drive, it has its high cost. So the key then is, how do we sober them up faster? Is maybe the question. Team awareness. Self-awareness, team awareness, situational awareness. There's 3 forms of awareness before you drive, right? You have to be, aware of yourself. You have to be aware of the team members you have. And you have to be aware of the situation out in front of you. And it gets harder and harder as you move away from self, although self is probably one of the hardest. But I mean, situationally, it gets much more complicated. And so one way to look at it, and I'll talk about kind of strategies of how we actually coach and help the AAs. One of the top things that we call alertness. You have to be super alert, but you need to be alert of yourself, your team, your situation, which is same as awareness. And when someone isn't alert about themselves, the rest of it tends not to happen.
One obvious option, although maybe it's not so easy in most of our organizations, is that potentially that A job, C person, what if you give the opportunity for the C person to go down to a B job or a C job, where all of a sudden they can succeed and maybe get some foundational things. Because sometimes it seems like your whole point is we're spending a lot of time on these particular people. And some people might actually find that to be a relief.
So I look at it as most of us who have been in these positions, if you're fortunate enough for someone to volunteer to step down from that A role to a B role, if you're fortunate enough that they might retire sooner or quit, and I say fortunate.
It can feel like a demotion. This is the thing we struggle with all the time because we don't have a fire policy. We don't fire. We have a no fire policy. So then people will sometimes say, God, would it just be easier if I just got fired versus demoted? God, would you rather be fired than demoted? But the shame that comes with that. But this is exactly what we're going to talk about, which is to give them a C job, not demote them out of the role. They're still in the role, but have them practice
A training
learning
job.
about who they are
Right.
here, learning about this and something that's easier. It's easier to see yourself in something that's not core to your. Anytime you
Let me add
attack,
this.
sort of, I'm in charge of this. I'm really not. If I'm unself-aware, I'm scared, I'm desperate, I feel emotional tilt. I'm in my head. It's when people are in their head. This whole thing can just be described as being in your head. So they're not really hearing you. This is, you know, I'm protecting. This is my job. But if you put me on something else and you bump up the stress there so you can see who they are even faster, they can say, oh my God, I am like that. And I'm like that in my main role, my A job. But that's exactly what we're gonna talk about.
So let me just add this one piece. It might help alleviate some of the questions. When you think of most things, it's awareness and action. You get aware, and then you go and act, right? Even the OODA loop is all built this way. But what tends to occur in most of these cases is you have to flip it oftentimes, especially when someone's in a C state. Talking to someone about being stuck in their head doesn't get you anywhere. And this is what we tend to do, right? We try to, through volume and different creative variations, just to talk to them to see that you're kind of hurting us, yourself, everything's bad. And how many times have they nod and get it, I get it, and then they come back and nothing's changed. And when you're talking about the demotion to the B role, this is what dial down responsibility is. The way we do it, because they're not offering, is we create 2 roles of Bs that equate to 1 role of A. And then now you're creating 4 roles of Cs to create, it's like, this is a spiral that we get into. So oftentimes we need action to help them become aware. So the way we looked at this was this. When someone is a victim, 49% of their world feels like it is in their control. So in their control, or maybe in my control. And when you ask them what's going wrong, they're pointing outwards. And the goal, by the way, is to just help them make a 2% jump. And that 2%, by the way, is so hard. It's so much emotional toil that it sounds easy, 2%. So they become empowered. And when you become empowered, you're now 51% of everything is in my control. And why this number is important, and this is where you start to point most energy, most things inwardly. This is important because once something is majority, we tend to attack the majority. How many times, we got this great phrase from this team at the Air Force called PACE. They had this simple formula. They said, perception drives mindset, and then behaviors follow. So oftentimes the perception we have is it's impossible. So when something you believe is impossible, our mindset is why bother? And then have you ever seen the behaviors of someone who has that mindset? It never improves. It's impossible, right? When you're in a victim state, it's the Air Force that's the problem. It's my, you have issue after issue, and not that they aren't true. It's that you believe 51% of most things are out of my control. I only 49%, so why bother? Even if I did everything perfectly, I won't even get majority. Versus when you get empowered, there are 2 things that happen. You say, despite the constraints, what are my options and choices? Despite the constraints, what are my options and choices? And this is what you want to help someone get to. And so the way you do it, this awareness in action, is this. If you tend to have an A job, data point number 1. If you can find a way, and once again, you don't have to use the feedback app, but if you can find a way for them to get feedback on that A job, that's data point number 1. But it's never enough. We're pattern recognizers. So you need to help them create data point number 2. And sometimes you might need data point number 3, 4, and so forth. And data point number 2 is to take a C job. And one of the, sorry, you can't see down here, but kind of run out of whiteboard. You have to test as the coach your outcome bias. Meaning the job still needs to be important enough, but you should focus on being able to coach them versus it's important to get the job done. If you find yourself giving them some task where getting the job done, right, is more important, meaning you are unable to underwrite and risk the job getting done poorly, but for the purpose of helping them see what's happening. Data point number 2, you need then feedback from colleagues on this, and then you hope to coach them. Now, there are 2 things that we found of why we ended up building the feedback app the way he did. One was people who are in, especially A jobs, in C states, people struggle to give them feedback, especially to their face, because they tend to either be hostile or fragile, or both. The other part is this: when they're in this state, they attack the giver. Attack the giver, they spend more time discrediting the giver than accepting the feedback. And one of the most maddening things that we had to develop, and we did all of this manually before we built it into an app, was that if you look at what's happening with the feedback, we set it up so you can't see who said this. Like, you want to blame someone for this terrible feedback. You know it's in your community. It's in this room. But I can't tell who it is. And the most maddening thing is to get them to start to only look at themselves. And the biggest key in the feedback is not what one piece of feedback says, but it's the pattern when it starts to connect. When 6, 7 different people, 8 different people say the exact same thing, it has to make you pause and say, is that true? But it's crazy for someone, if you knew who they were, you could find a way to discredit every single one of them. Questions? There's some more questions.
So just for clarification, the arrows going out.
Yeah.
Who are we talking about? Peers or potentially direct reports?
When you're a victim?
Right.
You blame everyone but yourself.
I'm sorry, the other way around. So when they're getting the feedback,
yeah,
is it coming from peers or direct reports or just exclusively peers?
It's someone in your community. One of the things that we found out through the data was this. I forgot what's called intra versus inter. Feedback from outsiders observing you is much less weight and valuable than what's happening from in your community. You need to hear from those in the arena who've faced the consequences of what happens in the job and who are there shoulder to shoulder with you. They have the most truth of every nuance of yourself. They know you better than you think.
I appreciate that, because a lot of times is if they know it's just one group, they'll dismiss that too, yes, potentially. But I don't know if you're going to address this more or not, but what if we get to that point, mm-hmm, and it looks like they got so much of a blind spot or something, and it's issues of character, perhaps? What do you do?
You know, so there are so many. So once again, we've met a lot of very, very interesting people. One of the guys, I tell a story, I think it's on one of the previous talks, this guy Peter Gorman. He did this amazing work where he literally got people who are paralyzed, 6 years of treatment, never can walk again, to start walking and running marathons. And he's called like this magician or Jesus of Mayopac. And the simplest thing he said, because I asked, you know, I'm on the more arrogant side, so I asked him a very simple question: how'd you do it? What's the trick? And the common theme that's always come out is that human beings are actually wired to self-correct. We are wired to do the right thing, but we don't know between right and wrong, which is why we tend to do the wrong thing. So getting that truth is so difficult. Greg, I think, is going to share this video. in fact, working with the Vice Chief of the Navy, one of the top things they're working on is transparency and resiliency, and they go hand in hand. Transparency is truth. Resiliency is being able to deal with that truth. And what Greg will show you is that it's this funny experiment with apes and like monkeys. The truth makes people go ape shit. The truth is that painful. Now there's a process. We call it LBR in different ways to help them process it. But the good news is this: the amount you need to do of change is really just 2%. Like there are many things that it's like almost having, we all walk around with viruses in our body, but when it's at 49%, we can still function.
You know what's interesting? Can I just say the way that even you asked about the character has such a tabooness to it. You know, even the way you said, like, what if that's something to do with their character? It's always going to have, it's like who you are, and tackling that and seeing feedback that's tied to who you are as a person versus I think somebody put this in the survey, you know, giving feedback on their skill or a certain behavior. That behavior is coming from them. That is them. So there's a tabooness to talk. It's very hard. This is why this work is so hard, because to feel like you're attacking anybody's character, we didn't cover this, but I think we were going to say that this is the majority of us are going to be in this state at some point, meaning everybody. We're calling this kind of the bench. It's almost like the majors, the minors, like you're always in training. And the fact that everybody is going through it takes the stigma, I think, away from it, that we're all working on our character. We all have big flaws in our character, the arrogance, the insecurity, the whatever. And I think when it's open and everybody's working on it, it's less hard, I think, to actually start to work on, you know, if you're exposing character, to actually work on character. Because generally speaking, it's going to come to that somewhere.
And I agree with that. I think it's really about moral leadership in many ways. What kind of culture are you creating? And for me, it takes time, but it can't be just hit and miss, because you have to go there.
But when you say hit and miss, I think of it as this. So the amount of time that we found that it takes to kind of make this change for most people is 90 days. Now that's if you apply it with consistency, right? So this is the consistency. Oftentimes we think one and done, right? Which is kind of the jumpstart solutions. It's kind of why it's sort of like, you know what, I took this thing, I tried it once, and you know what, didn't work, right? It's going to take a level of consistency. And when you do, what we have found is literally human beings can start walking again when they're told they can't. It is crazy how much we're wired to actually self-correct and do the right thing. But like I said, the first thing I want to touch on was because we as coaches who love them and want to help them actually, or frustrated, feel the need to help them, are actually making it worse. And so recognize, how do we dial down the wrong we're doing to make it worse and worse? And then how do we start to actually dial up and what we're trying to do to help them? You know?
I don't know if this is on. So two things. We saw that about 3 to 6 months in our organization. But what I'm left asking is, when you got job A and player C, we all make risk decisions, right, in our leadership positions in our DoD organizations, to make sure we don't put a C player in an A organization. So the first thing I look at when I say that is, what's changed? Did the mission change? And now what I was perceiving this as an A player going to an A job, one of those conditions changed. Or did some life factor happen to that individual person that I have to address in a different role? So those are the two questions I ask. How did I get a C player in an A job?
You know what's fascinating? So we had this conversation right before you walked down here. One of the guys who spent a ton of time with, his name Jim Leary, he's like almost 80 years old, coached people in many different industries, and he runs one of the best tennis camps in the world. And he would talk about how when he looks at young tennis players, the ones that turn out well versus their all issues, right? What the difference was. And he said the ones who were issues were overparented. The parents were just hovering over every aspect, whatnot. And the ones who turned out normal, he looked at what they did nothing. And he's like, that made no sense. What do you mean they did nothing? And his point was, life is full of so much stress that just letting them train with life stress is actually what got them normal. Now, I share this because I think about the stresses. You're mentioning just some of them, something happening at home. You know what happens with a promotion? The expectation level now of everybody around you is that you're far better than you were yesterday. With just one day's notice, you are now given a title that says you're much smarter and better in everything. And you know you're not. So what happens? You have outcome bias seep in. And if you don't start to process this stuff, this is where the processing comes in, right? Which is why we'll talk about the truth, feedback, and then the processing. Most people, when you start, it's funny when we go and give talks in different places, you talk about the newly promoted generals, and we've trained a lot of them in different forces. And who's excited, who's ready for it? Like a third easily is, like ready. I've been waiting for this my whole life. And a third, when they're truthful, are like, I don't know what I'm doing. I can't believe they promoted me. I don't deserve to be here. And a third are unsure. And I find that usually within 3 months to 6 months, every single one will be in roughly a same boat, minus the few that happen to just escape with something lucky they got done and something worked. The problems of leading people, of the different uncertainties, and this is the elephant versus the cheetah world, right? I think we've all faced this. If you go back 10, 20, even 30 years, like everything just moves slower, right? I mean, and the simple analogy I always used was the news. I mean, the news of this month or last month's news is still relevant before. Now, like, you feel something's inadequate in you if you didn't catch the fact that it came out in the last 10 minutes. People brag. Now, I saw this 30 seconds ago. You're already late. Like the need to process information, and then when you have to act. So the need to process information, the need to make calls is so much faster than before. So, yeah.
Hey, I had a question about data point 1. When you're talking about C players and A jobs and struggling to give feedback. So you're talking about the folks on the team, the outside people struggling to give feedback to that C player?
I think especially I think an outside coach kind of might just come in and just say, here's what, but anybody who's in the team will struggle.
And then you put under there about the person being hostile to the feedback. So is it the outside person is reluctant to give feedback because they know that C player is going to be hostile?
Or fragile. You might break them, and they might, hurt themselves.
And hostility will come from silence is the greatest form of hostility. You're giving somebody feedback, and they're just looking at you like what's going on in their head is they just want to they're mad. And when they're not saying anything, what I take away as a coach is they're really angry about this. I feel the hostility, giving the feedback to that person, or I feel like they're about to burst out in tears. And those are the two extremes.
So as the coach or team player, how do you get past that to give the feedback? What's
the point here is that the second thing we do wrong is separating, because the problem is this, because nobody wants to give them feedback, right? And they'll be attacked. As the coach, you're the only one giving the feedback. And then you're trying to also coach them. Let me give you the feedback of what you're doing wrong, and then let me help you process that feedback I just gave you. There's the
making sure you do the second part.
You can't. You need to help them process it.
I'm saying we want our team. We're going to try this. I think tomorrow we're running a situational workshop, and we're going to try the actual split coaching, kind of the AA and the AC in the same session. We're going to experiment with this tomorrow.
We've never done that before.
We've never done this before. It's like a lot of new stuff.
My idea, of course.
Yeah. So, I would never do this in anyone. But especially in front of so many people. But having the group that's in this A job at C player coming in and walking us through the feedback that they're getting from their team, having them first go through and process it, and then walk us through it, we can then help them process the feedback they're getting from other people who've worked with them. So they can but as opposed to, we're typically giving them the feedback, and we're going to get one of those two reactions at extreme. Right?
So like, oftentimes they say when you do a performance evaluation, one of the worst things we do is we sit eye to eye. Is one of the worst, right? I mean, you're trying to tell them the feedback and you're trying to read each other's eyes. I mean, it's just awful. They say what's better is literally put it on the wall, sit on the same side, and let's look at the feedback. So you're objectively both now trying to help develop this person we're seeing, which is why oftentimes the most difficult.
They say general notions are generally wrong. That is absolutely, you want to have eye-to-eye contact and conversation eye-to-eye with people. But when you're talking about them and their character
and their
trying
difficult
to look
stuff
at them, and it's one of the most awful things you can do to somebody, because they're trying to process it. They're just looking at you. They can't really, their emotions. And so when you put it on a wall, it changes, and sit on the same side with them, it changes everything. If you notice, when you take a walk with somebody and you need to give them critical feedback, traveling with people on a plane, a train, even with a spouse on the couch, watching TV, kind of, you can start difficult conversations a lot easier. And it
lying
feels
in bed,
cowardly,
right?
But it's not cowardly. It's because otherwise you're not going to do it. So would you rather there be eggshells and silence? And
I don't know if you have this with your spouse where like as right you're about to go to sleep, the biggest big bombs just get dropped. You're not looking eye to eye, so it's easier to bring up difficult things.
No, so I appreciate all this. I guess, how does this work? And one of my other questions was like the 90-day, right?
Mhm.
But in order for this really to be effective and to get the whole team on board, if there is one person on the team who doesn't give good feedback or provides that person an out,
Yes.
they become the hero of the team, who
so-
they now go to for all of their feedback. Right?
Excellent question. So this is where when you know who's giving the feedback, right? Because you know when you're this what they call confirmation bias. Right? When you know who's giving the feedback, I'm going to discredit everyone I don't agree with, and I'm going to then extra weight the one I agree with. But when you don't know, this is why we made it anonymous. You know it's in your team, but you don't know who gave it. All you can look for are the patterns. So as the individual being coached, you might glom onto the one thing that says it really isn't your fault. But as a coach, you'll say, okay, that's one data point from one person. But 8 or 7 other people are saying this exact same thing. You get to coach them with the emphasis of what's repeating. So, which is harder to do when you put names to it. It doesn't work.
Hey, Charlie, I just wanted to say, earlier you talked about doing the stats for why you need to look at work differently. This is far more valuable. Just so you know, that Wednesday conversation.
Yeah.
This is much better than, I think we hit the I believe button on, hey, the world's changing a long time ago. I'm just thinking in this room, there are executives in this room that lead other executives. You know, head of HR for the Coast Guard has SESs and very senior people with some offices that are literally one deep. So the head of childcare for the Coast Guard is one person, right? So this conversation about what do you do is near and dear to a lot of us. What I was going to point out in way back in the beginning, when you have budget constraints, you know what our government's like, the first thing to get cut is development.
Yes.
So I'm in my head right now, I'm thinking, okay, at noon, I've got to tell someone they've got to go to a school that they don't want to go to, and it's in the develop arena, already signed off by an 06. It's like, yep, you don't have to go.
Yes.
Hey, I'm an E9, I'm about to override that.
Yes.
So, hey, welcome to feedback in the real world, and I have to justify that. So believe me, there's a lot of this conversation, internal turmoil. How do you defend that? How do you know, how is that going to work out long term? And it's not the position we're normally in, but this feedback thing is huge, and the A versus C is a good conversation to have. So I just want to throw out that not talking stats, we appreciate that.
So there are 3 elements to this: jumpstart, sustainment, and measurement. Most of us think of development only in the jumpstart component. The sustainment is kind of baking it into an everyday week. In fact, one of the slides I was going to pull up. So does anyone need a bio break? I don't know. Yes? Do you want a quick bio break? And then what I'll do is I'll walk you through how we coach. There are 3 stages and 3 steps to how to perform and increase performance. One, and this is the hardest part, even for someone who's in an A mindset or state, is alertness. Versus the opposite of alertness is what I would just title information indigestion. You know, when you meet with someone and just information just is hard to get back and forth, that's both sides or one person just having indigestion. Versus you want it flowing rapidly. Oftentimes you feel what you would call eggshells. We created a term called NQRs, not quite right. You know, when you go to situations, you just feel NQRs, and you just leave kind of like the stuff you should have said and they should have said and you didn't. So alertness is very hard to get. Once you do, you look for real momentum versus you can't force it. Oftentimes you try to force momentum, right? It must be, it's the plan I made. And then aggressive action versus the notion of waiting for it to come to you. And this thing goes in sequence because aggressive action without alertness, kind of dangerous. Where there's momentum, applying aggressive action can have profoundly positive impact, but putting aggressive action where there isn't momentum isn't necessarily going to work. So let me walk you through, I think of this as different strategies. And one of the strategies that we always think about is playing defense first before playing offense. And when I think about one of the terms you'll hear is TP. So everyone in Next Jump is partnered with a TP, but a TP can have 2 meanings. When someone is in a C state, we think of a TP as a talking partner. It's someone that's just helping you process and bring to light, talking partner, bring to light the struggle and the challenge. But when you are actually in an A state, driving in an A job, think of this as your gym buddy. One of the most important things is having a gym buddy. And when you have a good gym buddy, you just work out harder. You go to more difficult things. And what the TP ends up doing is two things. It doubles your alertness and it doubles your speed. So you're able to get doubly alert, doubly fast. And truly, information is the driver of making the right decisions, the right calls. So there are three things kind of occurring when we think of defense. Defense being, even when you are an A player in an A state with an A job, usually at least a couple times a week, if not multiple times a day, you will go through challenges, which we call swamps, right? So swamp is very dark and murky. And literally what you are learning to do is to recognize the fastest way through swamps is going deeper into it to hit rock bottom and get out the other side. In essence, the muscle you're building is how to go in and out faster. It's not avoiding, it's not denying, because the thing that happens with the human brain, and it's just, I think, barely still understood, is that the things that we're not processing, that we feel desperate about, depleted about, we're just saying to someone before that, yes, when you have a C state player, when you're coaching a C player, you also go into a C state as a coach, right? The whole, can I get a little bit of your time? You're like, oh God, right? Depleted. Like, I mean, you feel stuck with them and you're trying to help them, but it's like, it's just bad things happening. So the process of going through in and out faster is the key. We've gone to a place where we can process really bad things in minutes. We can process it walking between meetings, but that takes practice. It's muscle, it's a skill. And so when we think about what's happening in this swamp, I don't know if you've heard this thing called ladders of inference. I can't remember who actually created it, but it's really good. But think of it this way. There's a pile of data, right? So life in front of us, and nobody has all the data, right? If anyone who ever tells you, they're lying, right? So ladders of inference looks like this. Two different people. There's steps 1, 2, 3. Step 1 is the data they select. Step 2 is how they process it. Step 3 is their conclusion. Said another way, these are my assumptions. Process is my logic. And what we tend to do is we tend to only share our conclusions. And why people argue endlessly is because they're just butting heads on two different conclusions. And yet, what you have to train yourself, right, your question?
Yeah, I was going to add beliefs. You have beliefs also in that ladder.
So like when I think I'm putting beliefs under kind of your process, because I'll explain to you how this gets developed, which is they come from your past, right? And so experience is usually bad things that usually happen, but the conversation is a hell of a lot more productive if both people share this. You share the conclusion, but you want to share this. You'll see this in the next exercise. We have 10X. We will model sort of a rating on the feedback, and then we'll explain why, right? And I think the conversations get a lot more productive when you're going through all of these, being able to explain, this is the data point I saw, and this is the NQR, and this is the eggshell, and because of my experience and my belief in this is why I think we should get rid of that person. Like, this bottom part is what's not shared usually. So if I take this one step further, going into the exact, sorry, this is not planned, so I'm running out of whiteboard space. I really would like a wall that's the size of this whole room, but so what's fascinating about, I think I said perception, mindset, behaviors. The word that a lot of times is used a lot is motivation, drive, lack of drive. Some people call it happiness. So this was an interesting thing we saw. It was Jim Leary who initially pointed us to this work, which is 10% of our motivation, our drive, our happiness comes from what's happening in our lives in the present. He said 50% comes from our past, and 40% comes from our future outlook. Now, no, I didn't say future because no one knows the future, but it's our outlook of the future. So when he initially shared this study with us, he said that, the past you can't change. So you're really only looking forward and saying that you can basically fivefold your motivation by altering the narratives you have of a future outlook. Well, we found other research from this group at this Tuftsum University ed tech group that was fascinating. They were telling us that the past actually isn't correct, that we alter our past every time we think about it. And in fact, what they found in the research is this: when we think about our past, as in reflect, the emotion we feel right then when we reflect gets attached to our memory of the past. So we are altering our past based on how we think about it. If you're one that tends,
So if you're a ruminator like me, this is bad, because every time you think about it, you're attaching a new emotion to it. So that history is now being rewritten every time.
worse and
you're
worse.
Thinking about it, making it worse and worse. So talk about bad, they call them bad mental models, right? You have or broken mental models. The more you ruminate, the more broken mental models you'll have, which means then you need to spend time unraveling those models, right? Or those beliefs or those assumptions, which is all Charlie's talking about here in the Ladders of Inference. If you're not talking about that stuff, you're operating with all those broken mental models.
And they're getting worse and worse. Every time you think about it, right? I know you've had at least two people who have seen something and then you remember it differently. You're both there, but you're like, that's not what happened. One remembers it, it's positive, one remembers it negative. And it's amazing, like the one remembering a positive is attaching the positive emotion as in altering the past memory continuously in a certain way, maybe to a fault, right? God, I always succeed. No, I never fail. Like, I mean, you could get overly confident to the point of arrogance. There's the flip side. You can ruminate. And so we were saying that there are two common ways. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Meghan was saying.
So I think this is what happens. So I'm more insecure than Charlie. He's more, I would call myself insecure, arrogant, just the language that we use. So take that or leave it. But that's how we think about the differences. I will tend to beat myself up over the past in the sense of I feel we've made a mistake or I made a decision that I will ruminate on it and I will beat myself up. That's most of my past narratives will be around that. The future, should I share this too?
Sure.
On the future side and the future outlook, generally speaking, it will be painting a hopeless future. This is really dramatic and extreme. I'm not that broken, but when I am broken, when I am broken, which happens, those are the two sides I can think about when I'm really it's like I'm beating myself up or I'm painting a hopeless future. Charlie will be more on the arrogant side, would more deny or ignore the past issues and challenges. But in the future, it's sort of more of a reckless and desperate acts will come out. And this phrase of I'm responsible, I must act. I'm the only one. I am I do this at home, by the way, I'm arrogant at home. The whole in terms of being a mom, I'm responsible. I must act if I don't do it. So that's usually why bad things would happen in the future, right? I paint hopeless, he will paint, I have to act, right? I'm responsible.
And this notion of the beliefs, our mental models come from the past. And the assumption we're making is our mental models are correct. And the reality is many of our mental models are wrong and they need to be constantly iterated and worked on, especially when information is changing in front of us every day, right? So a mental model of how I was as a teenager cannot apply now. And it applies to our motivation. These two are intricately linked because we tend to do something tied to our mental models. And so this ladders of inference in any given situation, being able to put out and bring to light, and the speed of bringing this to light. So if you are able to bring to light what is happening here and here in any given situation fast, and especially with the TP, and if the TP happens to ideally be opposites, it's amazing how much faster you can navigate and actually succeed in what you do. And so this idea of how do you shift from this 2%, it's not to say, you know what, I'm never a victim. No, we all tend to be victims at some point. We all will go through periods, and many periods, oftentimes, even in the course of one day, you feel this way multiple times. If you can take that swamp, go in, and what I mean by going in is share the ladders of inference, and especially on these things. So put another way, I'll put it more simple language. Oftentimes the past, the way we look at this looking backwards is we think about prompts of my worst case scenario versus where I should be by now, right? If you're able to put out my worst case scenario, this is our fears, right? Which is coming from our stuff in the past. My worst case scenario, it's colored by stuff that's happened to us versus this notion of where I should be by now. We can't reset when something's not going right. We can't reset and actually go into, okay, where I should be by now was before all this new information entered the equation. But I'm still held on to, I need to be here by now, right? And I have these terrible scenarios. And when you put these down on paper, on a situation, on a job where two people are looking at it, it's amazing what you're able to do. And, I mentioned over here, being empowered is despite the constraints, my options and choices. The first step was despite the constraints. To distinguish between danger and fear is very difficult for us to do. Danger is real. Fear is perceived danger. We make most of it up in our heads. And if you're able to separate that faster in real time, you can process swampy things much faster. And this is a muscle. The more you do it, the better you get trained. And as you navigate that, you become more alert. And once you become more alert, you can look to the next step. So all this is what we often spend time helping people who are in an A state. And I mentioned this because you can apply this to a C state. It's just, they can't process as much oftentimes. So we've shared this and it actually hasn't really resulted in a tremendous amount of stuff. So we found for them, we need to kind of stop them sliding backwards first, which happens usually from the coach as well. Now they do it as well, but questions on this real quick?
So just an affirmation. That's some really powerful stuff you just said, because what you're really talking about there is about having courage.
Yeah.
To go forward, and you have to do something with the past.
Yes.
Because that is true. We kind of remake it.
Yes.
Right. And so, to me, it's moral courage. What you just described is, if you have a model like that, it's going to put reality on what fear versus danger is.
Yes.
So I appreciate the way you put that.
It's fascinating as leaders, when we look at the communities and we work with the Navy that kind of, in essence, turned on. Tom and Greg will show you through the metrics and measurement when a community the community voice is on. It starts with an act of exposing the problems. It starts with an act of a leader usually going and processing this out loud. Guillermo did it. John did it, Rudy did it. They did it out loud to their command. And said simply, some people say this is an act of vulnerability, but I look at it as it's an act of being real. The people that work for us just want you to be real, right? It's like with children. They sometimes just want us to be real, but we coddle them. We think they can't handle the truth, right? Or we think that our job is to actually act stronger than we are when we don't know ourselves. And the act of being real is so scary. This literally feels like a bottomless pit you'll never get out of and you'll die and drown at the bottom. But the pathway going in and out, the faster you do it, this is literally the act that jumpstarts the entire thing to then try to build a community that does that. When the community is doing that in near real time versus like, let's do this session once a year. Let's accumulate all our problems and have like a, remember in Seinfeld, Festivus? Right? Let's have an annual Festivus where we get to talk about all the things that kind of suck. But if you're able to process this in real time, not only as the leader, but then all the way through the community, this is what's crazy. It just gets you in the game. You're not winning yet, right? It just gets you in the game.
I just offer one comment because I've been thinking about when I'm coaching people, that the power of the past and wondering how you can get them to recast their past by telling them, identifying what role they're playing in the story they're telling, and how they might change the narration. So if you view yourself as a different player, instead of casting yourself as the victim, can you cast yourself as someone that survived?
So can I tell you like the interesting we found on that? It's like taking someone who's down and trying to convince them not to be down, and they struggle with that. It feels like we're like kind of saying, if you just change a few, and I remember Jim Leary used to tell you this, the most maddening thing is you're struggling your whole life with this, and someone comes along and acts like in 2 minutes, I can just change the character a little bit, relabel the title, right? Victim to Superman, and boom, you're okay. And I know I'm simplifying
I'm
it.
not saying that. I'm just saying
but-
that when you start to reflect on how have you told the story? What role did you cast yourself in?
So,
How are you anchoring yourself in?
so can I tell you what we learned that was even simpler? Simply bringing it to light was enough to change 2%.
Now, if you want to, it's something that we have done that has been a little bit more, it takes more time, right? This is like kind of the one-off. We do this in the vineyard. We do an offsite for our leadership team. We did this last year. We're going to be doing it again in September, but it's to actually put up a sheet, you know, like these sheets that we have that you guys did the gallery walk on, and have the person you're working with take posties and literally help you put up all these different narratives of the past and what happened to you, and let them go into it, like really go into it. Because I think the more you feel somebody's trying to get you out of it, I'm not saying you're saying trying to get somebody out of it, but I think letting them expose that, which is hard to do. This is not like in a big group session, ideally somebody that you trust, but to actually write it up so you can see it. And at some point it will get to a point where it starts to feel ridiculous, you know, like the world is out to get me narratives. Well, and then you start to almost sound a little crazy, right? Because you feel, well, this could happen, that could happen, and it can go a little crazy. But once you see that and you've exhausted it, at some point it's like a good cry, you know, I know nobody likes to cry, but like once you get it out, you do feel better. It's like just getting it all out, all the bad, all the past, all the bad, being able to get it out and put it, maybe not your whole life, but maybe a certain situation that you're casting in the past that might need to be more isolated. But that process, at least for me, and we've done this, helps you at least feel like it's out. It's okay that I have that, you know, it's okay that I have that baggage. And anyways, we've made it more objective, where we literally put it up on a wall, put Post-its, and actually just try to like be able to look at it and bring it to light.
Yeah, I mean, I apologize. I was trying to make a point, so I exaggerated a lot. But like, I think the part that was empowering that we learned, and we learned this actually by studying how you grieve death, which is one of those things where it happened, the pain's there. And they found that talking about it to another human being, and it might take a year, it might take 2 years, it might take longer, but continuously bringing it to light was actually, the pain will never go away, but it's the dial that will bring that 2% change. And that was empowering for us to learn, because that's a lower bar than getting them to change the way they see it. Meaning just bringing it to light, despite how ugly it is, the way you see it, was actually the change agent. And that was pretty empowering. Sorry, good.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, when you talk about bringing it to light, what was, think about, you know, as you start to recognize some of these areas of improvement, I think it helps me, it's helped me in the past, you know, I recognize, okay, these are some things that I do or ways of thinking. And now that I recognize it, when it starts happening again, by wondering why I keep doing this, I say, oh, I'm doing it again. And so there's things sometimes I know to do to counter that. Whereas before I didn't even know why I was, you know, performing this way. Now that I have some recognition, I can do something about it.
So this was important. I mentioned TP, a training partner versus a talking partner. When you're in this state, you just need someone to listen. Someone who's in the arena, which is why it's almost like having your own, you're like therapists to each other in many ways, support group. This is different. This is where if you pick the wrong person, you can magnify it, make it worse. You get two insecure people talking together, they get paralyzed even further. You get two arrogant people, they will take what should have been a small fire into a bonfire. Like
we joke, so Charlie actually helped start the company with Greg, who's here, who's a partner of the company. And when Charlie and Greg were running the company, it was like, we have a good idea. And, you know, Greg would be like, let's do it. And they just would do stuff that, and then Tom and I, instead of engineering, the four of us were closely together, we would just be paralyzed to the point of doing nothing. But we're paired up separately, we do a lot better.
Yeah, so we've done some very, very, very terrible things. Just made logical sense to me, and Greg thought that was a doubly great idea. Like, okay, can I add just maybe one more piece before I show you the schedule? So there is another strategy that was kind of, so this is kind of defense. So when we think of offense, sort of the best offense to play, if it's two Fs, doesn't matter, you get the points. It's British spelling. So here, V1, V2, V3, 4, 5, 6. So I don't know if you're familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's work, but outliers, it was interesting about accidents and whatnot, human accidents. Most accidents tend to happen from human error, not one, but the fact that 7 or more are occurring in sequence. In a football game, a fumble is an error. But one error doesn't lose the game. Fumbles don't lose the game despite how much you hate it. It's the 6 errors that follow that lose the game. And this is the part, when we get stuck in our head, when we get in our C state, right? The very next thing you do, the 74%, we tend to do wrong. When you add 7 wrong things in a row is when bad things happen. When they went into the study of Boeing and the planes crashing, when they went even 40 years back, we spent time with this guy, Barry Gents, who was sent in to study 3 Mile Island, which is the nuclear meltdown, the only one that ever occurred in this country. It came down to human errors, and it came down to a sequence of 7 or more errors where people saw little NQRs and things wrong, but didn't speak up. And remember, one of the general notions that's wrong is we're trained, don't bring me a problem until you have a solution. What happens if it's a puzzle? I have a piece of the puzzle that shows me what the problem is. Somebody else has a piece of the puzzle. And if we don't start putting the puzzles on the table, we can't see what's happening. So the thing keeps driving and making more and more errors. And oftentimes even solutions now are puzzled from different people. And so the need to put information down, and the good news that we found, and we found this in almost every industry, was this: accidents occur in approximately 90 days, meaning it's 7 or more wrong things occurring, usually over 90 days. So if you are fearful of trying something for fear that it would go wrong, recognize if you correct somewhere before it hits 7, you will be able to prevent an accident. This happens for sports injuries. It happened for, when people actually hurt themselves from all types of different things imaginable. 90 days prior, the first signals start showing up. So on one hand, I see that as an empowering data point, because you can prevent most accidents. As long as you get voice and exposing of problems, and as long as a community is actually sharing and putting on the table, you can prevent most accidents. Winning, though, is different. Winning is very hard. Winning occurs where you need to do this usually in tight sequence of approximately 3 to 10 days. You need to make the right calls, 7 or more in a row, in 3 to 10 days. And if you think back to anything that you have really succeeded in that's stuck, right? A lot of things we succeed in, the minute we step out, the whole thing falls apart, right? So the way I look at it, 7 is when, call it a touchdown. You can make some great plays, don't care, right? You can get to the 1-yard line. If you don't score, it's like 0. It drops back to 0 unless you actually get 7. And what we found, think of it as approximately, V1 is version 1. You get roughly 50% return. V2, you get 30%. V3, 10%, 5%, 2%, 1%, 1%. So this gets to 99%, meaning each progressive amount for the same or even greater effort, you get lower return, which is what makes us stop. I know you know a lot of people in your organization that love to do V1s, right? I'm a starter of stuff. I like to start all kinds of stuff, right? Not finish, but start. And so most organizations are plagued with 2 things: just tiger teams creating tons of V1s everywhere and a gazillion V0s, right? I mean, a plan, right? Someone's telling you, you got to do this, right?
Because it feels so good, right? Because for the same amount of energy it'll take to get you to win all the way up here, 50% return. Like I always tell our engineers, some of them, I mean, the most amazing in our showcase, like we have showcases where they literally hack to get, it's like a hackathon, but trying to do quality code over a weekend. And they build amazing things over a weekend. Amazing. But there's a high. It's a lot of energy. It's like all-nighters, high energy, but the return is high because they've actually built something. They have an app that they built. But then to get it to version 2, to version 3, and all these little nuances to go through, it's like you're going through swamps at each stage and you're getting such little return. It's just the return gets smaller and smaller, which is why they can't build something amazing where it's, usability, no issues, no bugs. That's much harder.
And one of the things that will tend to happen is this. So we learned this from sports a lot, but many other fields where, like, if you think of winning, the idea of a touchdown, it occurs in levels, meaning like this is 7 of the right things and you win. And then you have to usually do worse before you do better. And this is kind of only like level 1 winning. This is level 2. Organizations have the endless ability, just like human beings, to upgrade. But if you don't get to the 7+, it literally drops to 0. You remember the show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Like, if you get answers right, I think it was 1,000 was the first benchmark. If you get an answer wrong after, you'll still drop to 1,000. Then there was a next benchmark and you'll drop. So if you get to 7+, you will drop down and you will still have that. But if you don't, it goes back to 0. And so when we think of how to win here, and this is kind of going from alertness to momentum and then aggressive action. So 2 data points is a trend. Meaning, if you accomplish V1, it's a trend. And yes, it's only 1 data point, but it's going from 0 to 50%. Then when you have 3 data points, so when you get to V2, it's a strong trend. Your ability to press on something that's a strong trend, because after this, we're looking for what we call takeoff trend. So first trend, second trend. And reason why this is important is because progress, momentum, is motivation. Why for C players, instead of awareness, we go to action, is progress, is momentum, is motivation. When you feel and see things improving, happening, you get motivated. And it's fascinating when you find motivation. When we're on that high of feeling motivated, right? Because the opposite of, these things here and the outcome bias, sorry, not the outcome bias, the C state was this, where to have it. Oftentimes when you're not outcome biased, we're willing to sacrifice the short term for the right things the long term. Instead of desperation, we feel patience, right? Instead of depleted, we feel on fire, right? We said you are in a calm enough state despite the stress and whatnot, and you feel clarity and purpose. One of the things that we found was this: winning is so hard. We call this the pressing window. When you are feeling on fire, when you are actually, but combine that with being calm and patient and being able to not get obsessed in outcome and have clarity and purpose, you need to press. And that's where the aggressive action comes in. So the way that you win, when you're already in an AA, instead of going for a incremental percentage increase, but a 5x, 10x increase, is being able to first process the defense and then know how to play offense even better. Now, there's many more strategies. It'd be almost like too long to go into all of them, but like we listed other things like the gated process. We call it bending, informating. Bibs are brilliant in the basics. So yeah, so maybe I'll just end with one last sheet, which was, can you pull it up? Yeah, good, sure.
Yeah. What is that number again?
50, 10, 40.
But is it effort? No,
Oh, down here. This is
Oh,
effort.
no, return.
That's return. But the
Like-
effort is the same for each.
What would you say there about this? What do you
The
mean?
effort.
That's what we were talking about last night.
Think of it as
Effort.
almost 100% effort every one.
Okay.
But this is where, in the later stages,
Got it.
you get so much less, which is, think of it in sports. The first time you ever learn to do anything like tennis, you're like, wow, I didn't try that hard. I got pretty good. Incrementally, it gets harder and harder. And so the level of effort is tremendous to get the tiniest return. But this is what it takes to become an expert. It's what it takes to get a touchdown.
Okay. Thank you.
But we tend to talk ourselves out of it because it feels so good to get the 50%, which is why there's many of us who fall addicted to the V1s.